This episode of The Great War is sponsored by CuriosityStream. So go to curiositystream.com/thegreatwar and you can sign up. And if you do, you'll also get access to Nebula, where you can see current Great War episodes and other creators ad-free. There'll be more information in the video description below and at the end of this video. It's December 1920. And General Álvaro Obregón is sworn in as President of Mexico. This brings an end to a bloody 10-year conflict of assassinations, shifting alliances, US intervention, and bandits turned heroes. It's the Mexican Revolution. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to The Great War. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920 was a watershed moment in the country's history. The decade-long conflict cost hundreds of thousands of lives, created new constitutions and governments, and also created villains and heroes that are still talked about today. So in this episode, we'll take a look at all 10 years of the conflict that came to an end exactly 100 years ago in December 1920. The seeds of the Mexican Revolution were sown in the final years of the rule of dictator Porfirio Díaz. Now, during his 31-year rule, Mexico did modernize economically, but this created serious tensions in Mexican society. In the early 20th century, the vast majority of Mexico's population was made up of rural peasants, and they were unhappy with Díaz's rule. This was because the countryside had become dominated by haciendas, which were large farming estates owned by a few rich landlords. By 1910, about 80% of villages in Mexico were part of haciendas where the people worked as unskilled laborers. That left only about 20% of the villages where the peasants were independent and had control over their own land. To the peasants, the haciendas were swallowing up their land, especially native communities, and replacing their independence with low wages and poor working conditions. And in 1910, these tensions boiled over. But the challenge to Díaz's power came not directly from the peasants at first, but came from Francisco Madero, who was himself a landowner. He was supported by much of the middle class, who did want electoral and economic reform, but not an extreme revolution. Madero also wanted to gain the support of the unhappy peasants, and so he announced the San Luis Plan, which promised to give the peasants back much of their land. On November 20th, 1910, even though he was for the moment still in exile in the US, Madero called on Mexicans to rise up against Díaz. After some initial hesitation, peasants in the northern state of Chihuahua did revolt and managed to defeat the federal army. At first, they followed Madero, but soon the revolution began to escape his control. Both Madero and Díaz wanted to contain the peasant revolution, and so they agreed to a transition of power. Díaz was forced to resign, and Madero eventually won the subsequent election in November 1911. So the peasants had risen in revolt against the landowners, which had resulted in Madero becoming president. But for Madero and the middle class, the revolution had done its job. Díaz was gone, and it was now over. Madero told the peasants that they would have to disarm and give up their weapons in order for him to enact his plan to give them back their land. But the peasants refused. One of the most important peasant leaders of the revolt was Emiliano Zapata, a skilled horseman from the rural state of Morelos. Under his command, the Southern Liberation Army had already begun reclaiming and redistributing land that it had seized from the haciendas. Now, when the revolution began, Madero actually approved of Zapata, but the two soon drifted apart. Zapata was more radical and refused to disarm. His vision of society was one where armed peasants could protect their land and impose their will on the central government. When Madero promised Zapata new laws if he gave up his weapons, Zapata simply replied, "It strikes me that there won't be more laws than there are guns." By the end of 1911, Zapata had become disappointed in Madero and began to be suspicious of his goals. So Zapata developed his own plan called the Ayala Plan, which became an inspiration for peasants across the country because of principles like this one. "We give notice that regarding the fields, timber, and water which the landlords have usurped, the citizens who have the titles corresponding to those properties will immediately enter into possession of that real estate of which they have been despoiled by the bad faith of our oppressors, and maintain at any cost with arms in hand the mentioned possession." By early 1912, the split between Madero and Zapata was total. In a report to Congress, Madero spoke disparagingly of the Zapatistas. Fortunately, this amorphous agrarian socialism, which, for the rude intelligence of the farmers of Morelos, can only take the form of sinister vandalism, has found no echo in other regions of the country. So Madero had now split from the peasants, but he was wrong about the other regions of the country, which now began to rebel as well. But Madero's eventual fall from power would not come at the hands of the peasants, but because of enemies a lot closer to home. In February 1913, Generals Bernardo Reyes and Felix Diaz were broken out of prison, where they'd been sitting because they had rebelled against Madero after having served the dictator Porfirio Diaz in the past. They quickly gathered 2,000 men together and stormed the National Palace in Mexico City. Madero ordered General Victoriano Huerta to crush the rebels. But Huerta was in no hurry, since he actually had his own aspirations to power as well. Now Reyes had been killed in the fighting, so Huerta decided to negotiate with Diaz. They agreed to overthrow Madero together, after which Huerta would take power. This agreement was actually signed at the American Embassy in Mexico City because the US ambassador hoped that Huerta would bring stability to the country and secure US business interests. But stability was not to be. Just days later, Madero and his vice president were killed by the troops that were escorting them to prison. Their deaths triggered an insurrection in the countryside and resistance from the middle class, which was unhappy that a democratically elected president had been ousted from power and then murdered. Opposition to Huerta took the form of a group calling themselves the Constitutionalists. Now, this group consisted of politicians, generals, and peasants, and they were led by politician Venustiano Carranza and General Álvaro Obregón. And in 1914, the Constitutionalist Army won several defeats against Huerta's Federal Army. Things got even worse for Huerta in April 1914 when the United States military showed up. There had been a dispute in the port city in Veracruz about the arrest of some US sailors, and so the US Marines were sent in to occupy the port. For Huerta, this meant that his main source of military supplies was cut off from his control. Huerta now tried to convince the Constitutionalists that they should join together to fight the American imperialists who were attacking both of them, but the Constitutionalists did not agree. And their army continued to attack Huerta's Federal Army and eventually took Mexico City in July 1914, and the US Marines remained in occupation of the port at Veracruz. Huerta went into exile and Carranza took over control in August 1914. So between 1910 and 1914, power in Mexico had gone from Diaz to Madero to Huerta and now to Carranza. But the most famous figure to come out of all this chaos was someone else entirely, the bandit turned general, Pancho Villa. By 1914, Francisco Villa, better known as Pancho, had become one of the most important figures in the Mexican Revolution. Previously, he'd been a bandit and a horse thief, but starting in 1910, he had led peasants in revolt against the Diaz dictatorship. His army, which was called the División del Norte or Northern Division, played an important role in overthrowing Diaz and now formed the backbone of Carranza's constitutionalist forces. Villa's troops won numerous victories against Huerta's federal army, and he became an icon amongst the peasantry in the northern part of the country. But it was his unique character that really left an impression on observers. Journalist John Reed described him this way: "He's the most natural human being I ever saw. Natural in the sense of being nearest to a wild animal. He says almost nothing, and seems so quiet as to be almost diffident. If he isn't smiling, he's looking gentle, all except his eyes, which are never still and full of energy and brutality." Villa soon allied himself with fellow peasant revolutionary Zapata, and part of what united them was a distrust of Carranza and the middle class. Now, it is true that these two groups had united to oppose Huerta, but there were tensions between them. Once Huerta was defeated in 1914, constitutionalist leaders held a convention to determine the future. Now, Carranza wanted this convention to confirm his rule and end the violence, but things ended up turning out quite differently. The more radical peasant delegations at the convention, including the Zapatistas and the Villistas, adopted Zapata's land reform plan and demanded Carranza resign, which he refused to do, and in this refusal, he was supported by General Obregón. The alliance between Carranza and the peasant leaders was now broken, and both Carranza and Obregón fled Mexico City for Córdoba in the province of Veracruz. Villa and Zapata attacked Mexico City and captured it in December 1914. So the peasant leaders now found themselves in the unusual situation of being able to walk the corridors of power in the capital city. Writer Martín Luis Guzmán described the scene as Zapata's brother Eufemio gave a tour of the National Palace. "We went up the staircase of honor. As he claimed each step, with his tight, wide-seamed trousers, his drill shirt open below the waist, and his excessively broad sombrero, he seemed to symbolize the historic days through which we were living. For his boorish, confident figure contrasted with the refinement and culture heralded by the staircase. An ambassador would have moved respectfully up these stairs. Eufemio moved like a young stableman who thinks he will suddenly become president." So the peasant revolutionaries had conquered the capital, but neither Villa nor Zapata now claimed power. Their priority was regional power and land redistribution, not running the entire country. Villa summed it up himself to Zapata this way: "I am a fighter, not a statesman. I'm not educated enough to be president. I only learned to read and write properly 2 years ago. How could I, who never went to school, hope to be able to talk to foreign ambassadors and the cultivated gentlemen of Congress? It would be bad for Mexico if an uneducated man were to be president." Villa and Zapata believed that a representative of the middle class ought to be president, and so they supported Eulalio Gutierrez as interim president, and this faction became known as the Conventionists. So as 1915 began, there were now two governments in Mexico: the Constitutionalists under Carranza and Obregón, and their former allies, the Conventionists under Gutierrez, with the support of the peasants. The Mexican Revolution now became a civil war. Villa and Zapata's forces now held the advantage. and there were even some calls from within their own army to march on Carranza's stronghold in Veracruz. But neither peasant leader was comfortable with the idea of marching too far from their home states in Chihuahua and Morelos. And there were other internal tensions within the conventionists as well, and many of these centered on the problem of peasant soldiers attacking rich residents in Mexico City. The resulting clash saw Gutierrez and his ministers flee the capital and join the Constitutionalists in Veracruz in January 1915. And it turned out that Villa and Zapata's refusal to attack Veracruz gave General Obregón the time he needed to rebuild his forces into a new operational army. He launched an offensive and soon recaptured Mexico City, where Carranza was able to recruit 9,000 trade union members into his new Red Brigades and strengthen the Constitutionalist forces even further. Villa and Zapata now fell back on their home states and their armies became separated. This allowed General Obregón's operational army to strike at Villa first, which resulted in battles at Celaya in April and Aguascalientes in July. As his army approached Aguascalientes, Obregón confided in a report about the difficult conditions that they were facing. "We have supplies only for tomorrow, and our limited ammunition is only enough to take a town by assault. 4 leagues from Aguascalientes. Impossible to retreat because there's not enough ammunition or provisions, and because it would be very irksome. Perfectly aware of the risks I am taking, all our men will begin the advance on Aguascalientes at dawn tomorrow, with hopes, but little assurance, given our ammunition shortages, of occupying the town." The all-or-nothing attack had paid off, and Obregón had won a decisive victory even though he lost his arm in the fighting. The victorious Constitutionalists now offered Villa an amnesty, but he refused and returned to guerrilla warfare instead. Meanwhile, Zapata was isolated in Morelos. He did briefly reoccupy Mexico City, but he was mostly left alone as Obregón concentrated his forces against Villa. So Zapata used this time to develop his concept of the Morelos Commune, which planned for widespread distribution of land and industry. So the winners of the Mexican Revolution had fallen out and begun a civil war. Across the border in the United States, President Woodrow Wilson was now beginning to get concerned about how the trouble in Mexico might affect US interests and international politics. So he took action and intervened. During the troubles in Mexico, US policy had not been particularly consistent, and they'd supported some factions at some times and other factions at different times. They'd even sold weapons to Pancho Villa. But now that Villa had been defeated, Wilson wanted to ensure stability and secure trade. So he recognized Carranza's government. Villa was outraged. "I emphatically declare that there is much I have to thank Mr. Wilson for, because he relieves me from the obligation of giving guarantees to foreigners, and especially to those who had at one time been free citizens, and are today vassals of an evangelical professor of philosophy. I take no responsibility for future events." Some observers have argued that after his crushing defeat at Aguascalientes, Villa began to behave more recklessly. And some of his men certainly did in January 1916. Because a group of Villistas stopped a train in Chihuahua that was carrying 17 American engineers on board and executed them. Villa denied that he had given the order to do this himself, but this is still a question of much debate. In February, Villa led 140 mounted fighters on a raid across the US border into New Mexico and reached the town of Columbus on March 8th. His forces attacked, but accidentally shot into a horse stable they'd mistaken for a barracks, and they ended up killing most of the horses that they'd intended to steal. Nearly 300 troops of the US cavalry were based in the town, and they managed to return fire. But Villa's fighters were still able to raid the town center before they were beaten back. This was the first invasion of US soil since 1812, and it left 17 Americans and 100 Villistas dead. Now there's a lively debate about why Villa launched the raid against Columbus. Some have said that he wanted to avenge Wilson's recognition of Carranza. Others say that he had a personal vendetta against an arms dealer who lived in the town. And still others theorize that he wanted to trigger a Mexican-American war, which would cause Mexicans to rally around his anti-imperialist leadership. Whatever the reason, the raid put serious pressure on Wilson to retaliate. But he was cautious, because he didn't want to provoke Mexico into an alliance with Germany, which was at war with America's friends, France and Britain, at the time. So instead of declaring war, Wilson organized a punitive expedition, which was to be led by General Jack Pershing and supported by the 1st Aero Squadron. The goal of this 10,000-man force was to capture Villa dead or alive. And at the beginning, it even had the clandestine support of Carranza himself. But it turned out that the expedition was poorly planned and poorly supplied, and they didn't know the terrain very well, and they did not get any support from the local population. They were able to defeat Villa and wound him on March 29, 1916 at Guerrero, but he was able to escape once again. Pershing's force marched more than 500 kilometers into Mexico, but they could not corner the peasant fighter, and Villa's reputation grew even further amongst the peasants of the country. And the longer the Americans were in Mexico, the more tensions grew between them and Carranza's government. By June, he ordered Pershing to leave the country, and there were even small-scale skirmishes between constitutionalists and US forces. Eventually, in January 1917, the expedition returned home without having achieved its goal of capturing or killing Villa. Now, Wilson received a boost in terms of his motivation to end the expedition by the Zimmermann telegram, which had been sent from Germany to Mexico and proposed a Mexican war against the US. The Germans hoped that if Mexico attacked America, the US would be less able to supply Germany's enemies, France and Britain, with arms and supplies, which it had been doing since the beginning of the Great War. But in the end, Mexico remained neutral. So by 1917, the Americans had come and gone, and the Civil War was ongoing but less intense. Villa had been defeated, and Zapata was mostly taken up with regional concerns. And so Carranza now decided to reinforce his hold on power. Early in the year, Carranza introduced a new constitution designed to end the conflict. And the Mexican Constitution of 1917 was indeed one of the most progressive for its time. It included land reform, maternity leave, equality of pay, and a minimum wage. But this new constitution was opposed by the wealthy upper classes. In fact, one of Diaz's former ministers even called it the bastard offspring of a coup d'etat. And he and the other opponents objected to the constitution's stance on religion, private property, and foreign investment. Despite these critics, Carranza was elected president in March, although he didn't really have any serious opposition. General Obregón was relieved of his command and took a back seat in Mexican politics. Carranza now decided that the time was right to remove peasant leader Emiliano Zapata. So he sent government troops to Morelos to break up Zapata's commune. Now, the Zapatistas did fight well and defeated the government troops on a couple of occasions, but by late 1918, they were under such pressure that some began to defect from the peasant cause. Zapata was desperate for allies, and he even contacted the Bolsheviks. But he also learned of a split between the commander of the government forces in Morelos, General González, and one of his officers, General Jesus Guajardo. Zapata tried to convince Guajardo to join him, But then Gonzalez learned of this plan, blackmailed Guajardo, and so they agreed that Guajardo would gain Zapata's trust and then execute him. On April 10th, 1919, Zapata arrived for a meeting with the colonel, but was then promptly gunned down by his men. So by the spring of 1919, Zapata was dead, Morelos was reunited with the rest of Mexico under Carranza's rule, and it seemed that Carranza had finally triumphed. But the revolution was not yet over. The 1917 Constitution had promised a lot, but in the eyes of many leftist politicians and military officers, by 1920, Carranza had simply failed to deliver on those promises. The economy was a wreck because of the years of war, and they now called for Carranza to step down. Carranza did propose a successor who was close to him, but the military wanted General Obregón to take over the reins of power. Government authorities then tried to arrest and possibly also assassinate General Obregón, but he managed to escape. He fled the capital and now openly called for Carranza's removal himself, and he had the support of lots of Mexican state governors. Carranza tried once again to run to his safe haven in Veracruz, but he never made it. On May 21st, 1920, one of his own troops shot Carranza to death while he was asleep in his bed, because the soldier was tired of constantly being on the run from Obregón's men. It is possible that Carranza committed suicide, but it is usually considered unlikely. In the north of the country, at first, Pancho Villa felt that Obregón was an improvement over Carranza. But soon, fighting broke out between Villistas and Obregón's government troops. But neither side really wanted a war after the years of constant fighting. And so they struck an agreement where Villa basically went into retirement, was granted amnesty, and a 25,000-acre estate. By July, Obregón was essentially entirely in control of the country and appointed an interim president before he himself won the elections and was sworn in as President of Mexico on December 1st, 1920. For many historians, Obregón's election as president is considered the end of the Mexican Revolution, even though some argue that it continued for much longer, even up until the 1940s. Now, although Obregón did continue to ruthlessly suppress his internal enemies, his time as president is considered by most to have been a period of relative stability. The peasants received some concessions, a delicate balance was struck between the more revolutionary and the more conservative parts of society, and many Zapatistas even joined Obregón's government. On the other hand, Obregón's rule saw renewed rebellions, and it's likely that he even ordered the execution of Pancho Villa in 1923, just 5 years before Obregón himself would fall victim to a disgruntled Catholic assassin's bullet. So now that we've taken you on the wild ride of the Mexican Revolution, I want to change topics and talk to you about the wild ride of what it's like to be a history creator on YouTube. Our 18-part, 5-hour-long documentary series about the Battle of Berlin wouldn't be allowed on YouTube because it shows a part of our history that's not, how shall we say, advertising friendly. So together with other creator friends of ours, we teamed up to have a platform where creators don't have to worry about demonetization or YouTube's infamous algorithm, and where the subscribers are directly supporting the creators that they watch. The content is ad-free. For example, the Nebula version of this video doesn't feature this very ad that you are watching right now. So you might be asking yourself, what has this got to do with CuriosityStream? Well, they like documentaries and educational content, and so they partnered with Nebula to offer you a package. If you go to curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, you can sign up for CuriosityStream and not only get access to their library of documentaries, but you'll also get Nebula for free. It's not a trial, you'll have it as long as you're a CuriosityStream member. And for a limited time, CuriosityStream is offering 26% off of their annual plan. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula. And I think it's a fantastic deal. And since virtual learning is quite important right now, you can watch and learn about space with astronaut Chris Hadfield, or learn about the Battle of Berlin with our documentary series, 16 Days in Berlin. And if you sign up and watch, you'll be directly supporting our channel. So that's curiositystream.com/thegreatwar for 26% off. We want to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. And as usual, you can find all the sources that we used for this episode in the video description below. And if you want to support our channel, you can subscribe, and you can also support us on Patreon. And you can find more about that in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1920, a production of Real-Time History and the only history YouTube channel that would lay down its arms in exchange for a 25,000-acre estate.